Welcome to Nightmare Tales Before Bed, where we tell the scariest stories for your pleasure. There's no video so the screen won't disturb your slumber. Before we jump into the story, kindly subscribe, like, and leave a comment about what scares you most. Now, without further ado, where the whispers and shadows tell their tales. Welcome to your darkest bedtime. The fog rolled into Timber Hollow on a Wednesday morning, thick and gray as wet cement. By lunchtime, it had blanketed the entire town. At first, it seemed harmless, a nuisance more than anything. But then the smell hit, a sharp, acrid scent like burnt wire and charred plastic. People began coughing, their eyes watering, their skin prickling with invisible needles. Eli Mercer, a third-year biology major at Timber Hollow College, noticed it first in the cafeteria. He watched as Mrs. Baxter, the elderly woman who ran the salad bar, clutched her chest and stumbled into a tray of tomatoes. "Mrs. Baxter? Are you okay?" Eli asked, rushing to her side. She wheezed, her face pale and clammy. "Feels like flu," she gasped. By evening, the campus infirmary was overflowing. The fog pressed against the windows, tendrils curling through the cracks in door frames. People whispered about the smell and the sickness. By midnight, Timber Hollow's single hospital declared a state of emergency. Eli sat hunched over his laptop in his dorm room, the hum of his mini-fridge the only sound. He'd been scouring scientific journals and news reports, searching for an explanation. What kind of fog smelled like burning wire and made people sick? None of it made sense. His roommate, Chris, poked his head out from under his blanket. "Dude, just go to bed. It's probably just some factory spill or whatever." "There's no factory for miles," Eli muttered. "And this isn't normal." The next morning, Eli took samples. Armed with a mason jar and a pair of latex gloves, he ventured into the swirling fog. The smell was overwhelming, making his stomach churn. He filled the jar, sealed it tight, and hurried back to the lab on campus. Under the microscope, the sample revealed something horrifying. The fog wasn't just moisture and pollutants, it was teeming with microscopic, silicone-based structures, nanobots. They moved with eerie precision, their spindly limbs clinging to organic material. Eli's heart pounded. He'd read about nanotechnology in theoretical papers, but this was beyond anything he'd ever imagined. The bots were invasive, latching onto cells, rewriting DNA sequences. He ran a simulation on his computer. The results made him cold. The fog was a weapon. The next week was chaos. The fog didn't lift, it spread. Nearby towns reported the same burnt smell, the same flu-like symptoms. Then came the changes. People's skin grew mottled and gray. Their eyes glazed over, movements sluggish yet purposeful, like marionettes on invisible strings. The media called them zombies. Eli knew better. These weren't the undead, they were something worse, living beings hijacked at the molecular level. Eli holed up in the lab, running tests, desperate for answers. His advisor, Dr. Harlow, had succumbed to the fog days ago. Eli worked alone, his mind racing with fear and determination. "Eli, you there?" Chris's voice crackled through the walkie-talkie they'd rigged after the cell towers went down. "Yeah," Eli replied, his voice hoarse. "They're outside. The zombies. They're just standing there. Not moving." Eli peered out the lab's window. The fog was thicker than ever, and in its depths, shadowy figures loomed. "Stay inside. Don't let them see you." Meanwhile, across the country in a fortified bunker hidden beneath a remote military base, the true origins of the fog were coming to light. Project Eclipse, a black-budget government program, had been shrouded in secrecy for decades. Initially developed as a defensive measure, the project's goal was to create nanobots capable of neutralizing biological threats by altering the DNA of pathogens. But under the leadership of Dr. Victor Kessler, the project had taken a dark turn. Kessler, a brilliant but morally ambiguous scientist, had gone rogue. Disillusioned with bureaucracy and convinced humanity needed to be purged and perfected, he had repurposed the nanobots into a bioweapon. The fog was his first field test, a twisted experiment conducted without oversight or consent. In his command room, Kessler watched satellite feeds of Timber Hollow. The fog churned like a living entity, its victims stumbling through the streets. Kessler's lips curled into a smirk. "Fascinating," he murmured, turning to his assistant. "Prepare the next phase." "Sir," the assistant said hesitantly, "if this gets out." "It won't," Kessler snapped. "The world will thank me when it understands what I've done. Evolution requires sacrifice." Eli's breakthrough came in the form of a distress signal. A garbled message from a whistleblower within Project Eclipse confirmed his fears: the fog was a bioweapon. The whistleblower provided critical intel, a failsafe embedded in the nanobot's programming. An electromagnetic pulse, EMP, could disable them. But deploying it on the scale needed would fry every electronic device in the country. "You're talking about the Dark Ages," Chris said, pacing the lab. "No internet, no power, nothing. If we don't, there won't be anyone left to use those things," Eli snapped. "This isn't just Timber Hollow anymore. It's spreading." Chris ran a hand through his hair. "How do we even do it? The fog's everywhere." "There's an old broadcast tower outside town," Eli said. "If I can rig it to emit the EMP." "You'll need help," Chris said, his voice firm. The journey to the tower was a nightmare. Fog-choked streets were littered with abandoned cars and the shuffling infected. Eli carried a jerrycan of fuel for the generator, while Chris held a baseball bat. The burnt wire smell was suffocating. At the tower, they found the control room coated in dust and rust. Eli set to work, connecting wires, calibrating frequencies. Outside, shadows moved closer. The zombie's low groans sent shivers down his spine. "Hurry up," Chris urged, peering through the cracked window. "They're coming." "Almost there," Eli said, sweat dripping down his temple. The final wire sparked, and the console hummed to life. The zombies surged, clawing at the door. Chris swung the bat, keeping them at bay. "Eli, now." Eli slammed the button. The EMP rippled out in a deafening pulse, shattering every light bulb, every screen. The zombies froze mid-step, collapsing like puppets with cut strings. Back in his bunker, Kessler watched as his monitors went dark. He slammed his fist on the console, rage twisting his features. "Who did this?" he snarled. His assistant cowered. "We don't know, sir. But the fog, it's dissipating." Kessler's eyes burned with fury. "This isn't over. They may have won this battle, but the war for humanity's future has only begun." Timber Hollow was silent. The fog thinned, revealing a town forever changed. Eli and Chris emerged from the tower, their breath visible in the cold air. The smell of burnt wire lingered faintly. "We did it," Chris said, his voice hollow. Eli nodded, looking at the horizon. The world was dark, but it was alive. And that, for now, was enough. It started with the lights. Strange orbs of pulsing blue and white appeared in the skies above Sable Ridge, a quiet mountain town nestled in the heart of Colorado. At first, the residents marveled at the phenomena. Local teenagers captured shaky videos on their phones, uploading them to social media under captions like "UFO over Main Street" and "Aliens are here." The sightings made the local news, then the national headlines. By the third night, the crafts came. Sleek and angular, they moved with an eerie precision, their metallic surfaces reflecting the pale moonlight. People gathered in the streets, necks craned upward, watching in awe as the ships released tendrils of fog-like mist that hung in the air like ghostly curtains. No one knew what it was, but within hours, the fog descended over the town. Dr. Natalie Keene, a government biochemist stationed at the Sable Ridge Environmental Research Center, was one of the first to notice something was wrong. She stood at her kitchen window, staring at the faint sheen forming on the glass. It wasn't condensation. It was thicker, almost oily, with a faint iridescent hue. When she opened the window, a sharp, metallic smell hit her nostrils, making her gag. She slammed it shut and turned on the air purifier in her living room. The next morning, complaints began pouring in. Residents reported flu-like symptoms, headaches, coughing, and fatigue. Natalie's neighbor, an elderly man named Mr. Grayson, stopped her as she got into her car. His voice was hoarse, and his eyes were red-rimmed. "Dr. Keene, have you noticed anything strange?" he asked. "My air filters, they're completely black. Never seen anything like it." Natalie frowned. "I'll look into it," she promised. As she drove to the lab, she couldn't shake the image of his worn face, the blackened filters he'd shown her crumbling like ash. By the end of the week, the fog had spread. Reports from neighboring towns described the same symptoms, the same strange buildup of grime on windows, cars, and even swimming pools. A thick foam gathered in stagnant water, bubbling as though alive. The news channels urged people to stay indoors and wear masks, but it wasn't enough. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Natalie's lab became the epicenter of the government's response. She and her team worked around the clock, collecting samples of the fog and the residue it left behind. Under the microscope, Natalie saw something that made her stomach twist. The particles in the fog weren't natural. They were engineered. One night, while Natalie analyzed a particularly dense sample, her colleague Dr. Sanjay Patel burst into the lab, his face pale. "You need to see this," he said, leading her to a screen displaying the latest chemical analysis. "This can't be right," Natalie whispered, staring at the results. The fog contained compounds made of elements that didn't exist on Earth. One in particular, a silvery, carbon-like structure, showed properties that defied known chemistry. "It's extraterrestrial," she said, the words heavy in the air. Sanjay nodded. "It's not just foreign. It's weaponized." The alien crafts returned as the fog tightened its grip on the nation. Satellite images showed the mist spreading like veins across the country, turning rivers into frothy nightmares and darkening the skies. Natalie's team discovered that the alien compound in the fog acted as a bioweapon, infiltrating human respiratory systems and rewriting cellular processes. People weren't just getting sick, they were changing. In Sable Ridge, Natalie watched in horror as her once friendly neighbors grew aggressive. Their skin developed an ashen pallor, and their eyes glowed faintly in the dark. They moved with jerky, unnatural motions, as if their bodies were no longer entirely their own. The government's initial response had been to deploy troops to contain the fog. But bullets didn't work against mist. And when soldiers began succumbing to the bioweapon, the situation spiraled further out of control. The president declared a state of emergency, but communication was faltering. Cell towers failed, and radio signals grew distorted. In a desperate bid for answers, Natalie's lab received a direct order from the Department of Defense: find a solution. They had access to every resource available, but time was running out. The tension in the lab was palpable. Machines hummed and clicked as Natalie and her team worked through the night. The air was thick with the smell of burnt coffee and the acrid tang of cleaning solvents. On the surface, it was chaos, papers scattered across desks, data scrolling incomprehensibly fast on monitors, and the occasional frustrated outburst from a researcher. But underneath the chaos was purpose, a desperate, unyielding determination to find an answer. "Natalie, over here," Sanjay called, his voice sharp with urgency. He was hunched over a microscope, sweat beading on his forehead. Natalie rushed over and peered into the eyepiece. What she saw made her stomach drop. The alien compound was replicating, forming tiny crystalline structures that branched out like frost on a windowpane. It was beautiful in its intricacy but horrifying in its implications. "It's self-organizing," Natalie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's building something." "But what?" Sanjay asked. "And why?" They worked tirelessly, testing various substances to disrupt the compound structure. Acid. Alkali. Extreme heat. Nothing worked. Every failed attempt added to the weight pressing down on Natalie's chest. Time was slipping through their fingers, and the fog outside grew thicker by the hour. Then, a breakthrough. Natalie was reviewing data from an experiment conducted earlier in the week, one she had dismissed as inconclusive. The fog's compound had reacted oddly to a specific frequency of electromagnetic waves, momentarily destabilizing before reassembling itself. She bolted upright, nearly knocking over her chair. "Sanjay! Get everyone in here," she shouted. Within minutes, the entire team had gathered around her workstation. "What are we looking at?" asked Clara, another researcher, her voice laced with exhaustion. "This," Natalie said, pointing to the data. "The compound's molecular bonds weaken when exposed to high-frequency electromagnetic waves. If we can amplify the frequency and sustain it long enough, we might be able to neutralize the fog." "Might?" Sanjay echoed. "It's a long shot," Natalie admitted. "But it's the only shot we have." Testing the theory was a nerve-wracking process. The first few attempts failed spectacularly, frying equipment and nearly starting a fire. The team's morale was fraying. Clara threw her gloves onto the desk in frustration. "We're out of time. People are dying while we're playing with wires and hoping for a miracle." Natalie grabbed her arm, her grip firm but not unkind. "We're not giving up. Not now." The final test came at 3 in the morning. The lab was eerily silent except for the hum of the modified transmitter they had built from salvaged parts. Natalie held her breath as the machine powered up, emitting a high-pitched whine that grew louder and louder. The fog sample in the sealed chamber began to writhe, its iridescent sheen dimming. "It's working," Sanjay whispered. The crystalline structures disintegrated, collapsing into inert dust. Natalie exhaled, her hands trembling. "We have a solution. Now we just need to scale it." Deploying the solution was another matter. The electromagnetic pulse, EMP, required to neutralize the fog would knock out every electronic device in the country, plunging humanity into darkness. The Defense Department balked at the idea. The economic fallout alone would be catastrophic, one official argued over a secure video call. "If we don't act, there won't be an economy left to save," Natalie shot back. "This isn't just a chemical weapon. It's a takeover." Reluctantly, the government approved the plan. Natalie and her team worked with engineers to retrofit old broadcasting towers to emit the EMP. It was a race against time as the fog thickened, and the alien crafts grew bolder, their orbs of light descending lower over major cities. On the night of the operation, Natalie stood at the base of the largest broadcasting tower in the state. The air crackled with tension as the team activated the device. "Here goes nothing," Natalie murmured, pressing the button. The EMP surged through the atmosphere in a deafening wave, shattering streetlights and plunging the town into darkness. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the fog began to dissipate, curling upward like smoke from a dying fire. The alien crafts shuddered, their lights flickering, before careening into the ground in fiery explosions. When the sun rose the next morning, the world was eerily silent. The fog was gone, but the scars it left behind remained. Millions were dead, and entire cities lay in ruins. Humanity had survived, but at a terrible cost. Natalie stood on the roof of the research center, gazing at the horizon. The air was clear for the first time in weeks. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the aliens had been testing them, probing their defenses. "We won this round," she whispered, "but they'll be back." In the distance, a faint light blinked in the sky, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. It began with the sun. Or rather, the lack of it. On a Monday morning, the small town of Blackwood woke to find itself veiled in a fog so thick that even the street lamp struggled to penetrate it. At first, people shrugged it off as a seasonal oddity. Blackwood was no stranger to mist rolling down from the nearby hills. But by mid-afternoon, the fog had only grown denser, the daylight reduced to an eerie twilight. By the second day, the town knew something was wrong. Flowers in the public park drooped, their petals tinged with brown. Grass turned brittle underfoot. In homes, pets became lethargic, their once bright eyes clouded. People began complaining of fatigue and nausea. And then there was the smell, a faint, acrid odor that clung to everything, like burnt plastic mixed with decay. "It's the damned fog," muttered Ed Grayson, the town's grizzled mechanic, as he leaned on the counter of the Rusty Spoon diner. "Never seen anything like it. Feel like it's sucking the life right out of me." Across the counter, Sam the cook nodded grimly. "Heard my cousin's dog keeled over yesterday. Vet says his organs just gave out. No explanation." At a corner booth, Anna McAllister overheard the exchange. A biologist and native of Blackwood, Anna had returned to her hometown after her father's stroke to manage his affairs. She scribbled notes in a worn journal, her coffee untouched. By the week's end, panic set in. The fog hadn't lifted, and its reach expanded. Neighboring towns reported similar phenomena: dying vegetation, ailing animals, and people growing weaker by the day. Blackwood's hospital was overwhelmed with patients complaining of exhaustion, shortness of breath, and unexplained weight loss. Anna's father, once on the mend, had taken a sudden turn for the worse. Determined to uncover the cause, Anna set up a makeshift lab in her father's garage. Samples of air, water, and soil lined the workbench, each labeled with meticulous precision. She worked tirelessly, her laptop and microscope her only companions. One evening, as she analyzed a sample of condensation collected from a window pane, a peculiar result caught her eye. The droplets contained microscopic particles, crystalline in structure and highly reflective. When she magnified the image, the particles refracted light in strange, kaleidoscopic patterns. "This isn't natural," she murmured, her breath fogging the microscope lens. Anna wasn't alone in her investigation. Local high school science teacher, Mark Penfield, had taken a keen interest in her findings. Together, they pored over data late into the night. Mark, lanky and perpetually rumpled, had a knack for spotting patterns Anna missed. "Look at this," he said one night, pointing to a graph on her laptop. "The particle concentration spikes at night. It's almost like the fog's alive. Like it's feeding." Anna frowned. "Feeding on what?" Mark hesitated. "Everything. Plants, animals, us. Whatever this stuff is, it's leaching life energy. And fast." They decided to expand their search. Borrowing an old van from Ed, they ventured into the hills, where the fog seemed to originate. The road wound through dense forest, the skeletal branches of trees looming like silent sentinels. The deeper they went, the worse the devastation. Trees stood as lifeless husks, their bark gray and brittle. The ground, once carpeted with moss and wildflowers, was a barren expanse of cracked earth. At the crest of a hill, they found the source, a dilapidated research facility, its windows shattered and walls streaked with grime. A rusted sign read, "Everton Technologies." Inside, the air was stifling, heavy with the smell of chemicals and rot. Anna and Mark moved cautiously, their flashlights casting long, jittery shadows. In a lab on the second floor, they found rows of file cabinets and computers coated in dust. Anna booted up a terminal, the screen flickering to life with a low hum. Project Revenant, she read aloud, scrolling through files. It was an experiment to create a renewable energy source by harnessing ambient biological energy. They tested it here in Blackwood. Mark leaned over her shoulder. Looks like it worked, too well. The files detailed how the energy harvester had been deployed into the environment in the form of aerosolized particles, the crystalline structures Anna had found in the fog. The particles absorbed energy from organic matter, converting it into usable power. But something had gone wrong. The harvester couldn't be deactivated, and the fog it created became self-sustaining. They evacuated the facility but left the system running, Anna said, her voice shaking. They just abandoned us. A sudden noise echoed through the building, a low, guttural groan. Mark froze. Did you hear that? Anna nodded, gripping a wrench she'd picked up earlier. They backed toward the door, their flashlights darting over the room. The groan grew louder, joined by a wet, slithering sound. From the shadows emerged a figure, its skin gray and translucent, veins glowing faintly with the same iridescent sheen as the particles. Its eyes were empty sockets, and its movements were jerky, unnatural. Run! Mark shouted. They sprinted down the hall, the creature lurching after them. Anna's heart pounded as they burst through the facility's front doors and into the van. Mark fumbled with the keys, the engine roaring to life just as the creature slammed against the passenger window. They sped away, the fog swirling ominously in their wake. In the following days, the fog's creatures became bolder, venturing into town. One night, Anna's neighbor, Mrs. Harlow, was attacked in her garden. Anna rushed to help, only to find Mrs. Harlow surrounded by 3 of the translucent figures. They moved with unnatural speed, their limbs twitching in erratic bursts. Leave her alone. Anna screamed, brandishing a rake. The creatures turned to her, their hollow eyes eerily focused. Just as one lunged, Mark appeared with a flare gun, firing it into the air. The creatures recoiled, emitting shrill, inhuman shrieks before retreating into the fog. Light hurts them, Mark said, panting. Anna helped Mrs. Harlow to her feet. We need to figure out how to stop this before it's too late. Back in Blackwood, Anna and Mark presented their findings to the mayor and a few trusted officials. The town had little time, the fog was spreading faster, and its effects were becoming more severe. People were collapsing in the streets, their skin taking on the same translucent quality as the creature they'd encountered. We have to shut it down, Anna said firmly. The facility's core is generating the fog. If we destroy it, we might be able to stop this. And if we can't? The mayor asked. Anna met his gaze. Then there won't be a Blackwood left to save. The final confrontation was harrowing. Armed with explosives and wearing improvised protective gear, Anna and Mark returned to the facility. The fog inside was thicker than before, pulsating as though alive. The core, located in the basement, was a massive, glowing sphere surrounded by a web of crystalline tendrils. This is it, Anna said, setting the charges. As they worked, the groans began again, growing louder and more numerous. Figures emerged from the fog, their numbers multiplying. Mark fought them off with a crowbar, buying Anna time to finish setting the detonator. Go, she screamed, pushing him toward the exit. She hit the trigger just as they reached the surface. The explosion shook the ground, a blinding light consuming the facility. The fog writhed violently before dissipating, the air suddenly clear. In the days that followed, life in Blackwood slowly returned to normal. The plants began to recover, animals returned, and the people regained their strength. But the scars remained, empty houses, vacant chairs at dinner tables, and a lingering fear that something like this could happen again. Anna stood on the hill overlooking the town, Mark by her side. "Do you think it's really over?" he asked. She didn't answer, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Somewhere out there, she knew, the technology that had nearly destroyed her town still existed. And she vowed to make sure it never harmed anyone again. The dense fog rolled in at dusk, creeping through the city like a living thing, slowly swallowing everything in its path. It wasn't the typical early evening mist that one might expect in a coastal town. This fog had weight, an unnatural thickness, and an ominous greenish hue that cast everything in a sickly glow. The air tasted metallic, as if the world itself was holding its breath. People hurried home, locking doors behind them, but the fog had other plans. Amelia Winters stood in the entrance of the city's ancient library, her fingers lingering over the cold, rusted handle of the door. The library had stood for centuries, a stone sentinel guarding the secrets of the past, but tonight, it seemed less like a place of knowledge and more like a tomb. She had seen the fog's arrival just after dusk, when the sky had been swallowed whole by thick clouds. The streets had emptied quickly. But it wasn't the fog that had drawn her here, it was the strange whispers she'd heard in the dead of night. Whispers that sounded like her mother's voice, calling her name. Amelia had never been one to shy away from mysteries, but this was different. She had written about strange disappearances, bizarre occurrences, and supernatural events in her past stories. She had even visited remote villages, interviewing witnesses of the unexplainable. But this was something deeper. Something that didn't just tug at the heart but at the very edges of sanity. The voice in the fog wasn't the comforting sound of a memory, it was an urgency, a call to action. Her fingers trembled on the door handle as she pushed the massive wooden door open. The creaking of the hinges sent a shiver down her spine, breaking the silence that had stretched over the city. Inside, the library was bathed in shadows, the air thick with the smell of dust and old books. It felt different tonight, heavy, like something was waiting for her. She couldn't shake the feeling that the fog had followed her in here, seeping through the cracks in the building, crawling into the corners of her mind. The library had been her mother's world. Her mother, a librarian for decades, had raised Amelia here. She'd spent countless hours between these shelves as a child, her mother's gentle voice guiding her through the pages of countless books. The warmth of the hearth, the soft rustle of paper, it was all part of her memories. But now, the library felt more like a mausoleum than a place of learning. The mist outside seemed to breathe in time with her own pulse, as if the world itself was waiting to exhale. She walked slowly through the library's aisles, the faint sound of her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The faint light from the windows above cast long shadows that twisted in unnatural ways. As she passed an old row of books, the whisper came again, clearer this time, calling her name. Amelia, her heart skipped a beat. It was her mother's voice. But no, her mother had been gone for years. Amelia hadn't even been able to attend the funeral. She had been away chasing another story, one she hadn't cared about nearly as much as the loss of the woman who had raised her. She had let her mother die alone, and the guilt of it gnawed at her. She couldn't ignore it. Her mother's voice, even if it wasn't real, had always been there, like a comforting presence in the back of her mind. A flicker of memory. But now, this wasn't comforting. It was something else entirely. Desperate. Calling her in a way that made her feel both safe and terrified at once. "Mom?" Amelia whispered, her voice trembling in the stillness. But the voice didn't answer. Instead, the fog outside seemed to press against the windows harder, thicker. The shadows deepened, wrapping around the corners like dark fingers. She continued forward, drawn by the whispers, her heartbeat quickening with every step. The large reading room lay just ahead, the grand chandelier above swaying slightly as though stirred by a breeze, though no wind had touched it. The smell of the fog seemed stronger now, a metallic tang in the air. The whispers led her toward the center of the room, where a figure stood, silhouetted against the fog. At first, the figure seemed almost too faint to make out. It wasn't until Amelia took a hesitant step closer that she could see it more clearly. It was a woman, tall, elegant, with the soft curve of her hair and the gentle contours of her face. She was facing away from Amelia, but there was no mistaking the faint freckle on her left cheek. It was her mother. Or, at least, it looked like her. Amelia's breath caught in her throat. "Mom," she asked, the word escaping her lips before she could think better of it. The woman turned slowly. As she did, the room seemed to dim further, and the shadows deepened even more, as if feeding on the sight of the figure before her. The woman's face, her mother's face, was familiar, but it wasn't right. Her eyes, those familiar brown eyes that had once looked at Amelia with warmth, were now pools of black, empty voids that swallowed all light. Her lips were stretched into a tight, unnatural smile. "I'm here, Amelia," the woman said, her voice sweet, soothing, but the words carried a hollow echo. "I never left." Amelia stepped back, her body rigid, as though she were being drawn into a nightmare from which there was no escape. Something was wrong. This isn't her, it couldn't be. Her mind screamed it, but her feet didn't move. The woman's eyes seemed to pull her in, as though they were the center of some deep, dark gravity. "No," Amelia shook her head, her voice cracking. "You're not my mother. You can't be." A soft laugh bubbled from the woman's lips, cold and distant. "Oh, but I am," she said, taking a step closer. "I've always been here, Amelia. You just never truly listened." Amelia's breath hitched as the woman advanced, her feet unwilling to move. The figure's presence felt suffocating, as though the very air around her had thickened, become more oppressive. "I've always been here," the woman continued. "Waiting for you." The fog outside shifted, pressing against the library's walls as if something was trying to break through. The whispers came again, now louder, layered with dozens of voices. All of them called her name. And then, one by one, the voices began to reveal themselves, her father's voice, her old friend Sarah, the distant echoes of people she had lost long ago. All of them. They were here. "You've heard us all, Amelia," the voice of her mother echoed, but now it wasn't just her mother's. It was a chorus, each voice blending into the next. "You've always heard us." The room seemed to stretch and distort as the voices swirled around her. Amelia's mind was racing, and the floor beneath her feet felt unstable. She could barely make sense of the words anymore, they had no form, no structure. Just a disembodied, chaotic blend of sounds. Her mind swam with memories, fragments, moments she thought she had forgotten. Her mother's sudden, unexplained death. The weeks of silence that followed. The time she had spent in the city, alone, chasing stories, leaving behind the people who had meant the most to her. The lingering feeling that something was missing. Then, it all came crashing down at once. The fog outside wasn't just an anomaly. It wasn't just mist. It was something more, a gateway, a trap. The figure before her smiled again, this time wider. The fog. "It's not just a veil, Amelia," it said, its voice soft and deep. "It's a prison." Amelia's breath caught in her throat as the woman took another step forward. "It traps the souls of the lost. Souls of the forgotten. Souls of the dead. And we are the ones who listen." The words hit her like a physical blow. Her mother's death had not been an accident. It had been orchestrated. The fog had been there, lurking, waiting, feeding on the souls of the lost, the souls of the dead. And now, they were calling her. She backed away, her eyes wide with fear, but the figure was relentless, advancing, until the space between them had disappeared. "The dead don't leave, Amelia. They wait. And we listen. We keep them. Stop, Amelia gasped, her mind spinning. What are you? Who are you? The figure leaned in closer. We are the ones who listen, it whispered. And you, Amelia, you've always heard us. You've always known. Amelia's heart raced. The voices, her mother's voice, were all merging, blending into a single, all-encompassing hum. Something deep within her began to stir, a buried truth clawing its way to the surface. The fog wasn't just an entity. It was a tool. A prison. And it had been calling her. As the woman reached out for her, Amelia's body froze. She understood now. She had always been part of this, tied to it in ways she hadn't understood. Her mother's death, her own grief, her desire to uncover the truth. It had all been leading her here. To this moment. The figure's hand was inches from her face now. It was cold, the skin like ice. You've been calling to them all, the voice whispered. The souls of the lost. Amelia screamed, but the sound was lost in the growing hum of the fog. She felt her body being pulled toward the figure, the library, the fog, all of it. The very air around her seemed to be pulling her apart. And in that moment, the truth became clear. The fog didn't just listen. It fed on her. On all of them. The voices grew louder, and Amelia realized, with a crushing weight, that it was her turn. She was the one they had been waiting for. The mist closed around her, thick and suffocating, and she was swallowed whole. The cycle had begun again. The military base, known only by its call sign, Doomsday 12, was a secretive research facility hidden deep within a dense forest, miles away from civilization. For years, it had remained off the grid, and only a few high-ranking officials knew of its true purpose. Rumors of government experiments and classified projects abounded, but no one could confirm them. Until now. The fog arrived one fateful night, creeping in after the sun dipped below the horizon, when the last of the base's personnel had gathered in the mess hall. The mist was thick, unnaturally so. It rolled in slowly, almost predatory in its advance, obscuring the view beyond the windows. What was initially thought to be a typical storm quickly became something else entirely. The air grew heavy, and a suffocating dampness clung to the walls. A chilling silence fell over the facility as the once clear sky turned an ominous shade of gray. Inside the base, the atmosphere shifted. The lights flickered briefly before going out entirely, plunging the facility into darkness. The backup generators hummed to life, casting a faint orange glow across the cold metal corridors. It was in this dim, unnatural light that the soldiers first began to notice something was wrong. "Tommy, where's Captain Thompson?" Brian asked, his voice cracking with worry as he stumbled into the command center. His uniform was soaked from the mist. Tommy, a seasoned officer with years of experience under his belt, looked up, his jaw tight. "I don't know, O'Connor. Last time I saw him, he was heading toward the storage bay. Maybe he got lost." Dr. Margaret Holloway, hunched over the command center's main computer, her fingers running over the keyboard in a mechanical rhythm, shot them a glance. "There's something not right about this fog," she muttered, more to herself than to anyone else. "It's too uniform. It's not natural. It's like it's controlling the atmosphere." Suddenly, the air thickened with the sound of distorted voices. The soldiers froze, glancing around, but no one spoke. "Did you hear that?" Brian asked, his voice shaking. Margaret shot him a sharp look. "It's just the fog playing tricks. You're tired, O'Connor. It messes with your head." But Tommy wasn't convinced. His gut churned with unease. "You said it yourself. It's not natural. We need to get out of here. Now." Margaret shook her head, her expression distant, almost feverish. "No. We can't leave yet. We need more data. This fog, there's something inside it. I feel it. As the fog continued to creep through the base, the disorientation set in. Soldiers, hesitant at first, began wandering through the mist, calling out for their comrades. Their voices were swallowed up by the dense air, and when they returned, something had changed. Their eyes were dull, their expressions vacant. The fog had already begun to warp them. Tommy? Brian's voice was strained as they stood at the base's central hallway. We need to get out now. This place, it feels wrong. We're not going anywhere until we find Captain Thompson and anyone else who's gone missing, Tommy replied, his voice tight with determination. Brian shuddered, glancing nervously at the fog swirling around them. I don't think we're going to find anyone in there, Tommy. Something's wrong. The fog, it's changing people. Tommy ignored him, but his eyes flickered toward the thickening mist. It was no longer just an atmospheric phenomenon, it was something else. Something alive. They turned a corner, and there, standing at the end of the corridor, was Captain Thompson. He stood completely still, his back to them, his hands clasped behind his back. The fog swirled around him, enveloping him like a shroud. His face was pale, almost gray in the dim light, his eyes wide and glassy, as if he hadn't blinked in hours, or days. Thompson? Tommy called, his voice rising in alarm. Where have you been? The figure didn't move. Thompson! Brian shouted. His pulse quickened, panic rising in his throat, but Thompson remained motionless, as though unaware of their presence. Tommy took a cautious step forward, his hand hovering near his sidearm. Captain, listen to me. We're here to help. What's going on? Why are you? Without warning, Thompson's head whipped around, his eyes locking onto Tommy with unnatural intensity. The sudden motion was jarring, the speed of it disorienting. His face was blank, empty. You shouldn't have come back, Thompson's voice echoed, but it wasn't his voice. It was distorted, like 1,000 voices layered on top of each other. Tommy stumbled back, his throat dry, his heart pounding in his chest. What? What are you talking about? You don't remember, Thompson continued, his voice now impossibly calm. But I do. We've been through this before. Over and over. The fog, it rewrites you. It erases everything. Tommy's mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. The fog, it wasn't just affecting them physically. It was playing with their memories, their very sense of reality. They were trapped. I knew it, Tommy whispered. The words came out like a breath of wind, shaky and uncertain. I knew it. What's going on? Brian shouted, his voice trembling with fear. He stepped closer to Tommy, his flashlight beam darting nervously from Thompson to the fog swirling around him. Everything is wrong, Thompson said softly, as if trying to comfort them. His voice, though calm, carried an eerie edge. This place, it's a machine. It's not a base. It's not real. It's not real? Brian repeated, the words crashing over him like a wave. What do you mean? We're real. This is real. Thompson's lips curled into a twisted smile. You think you're real. But you're just another cycle. Another experiment. Suddenly, the world seemed to fold in on itself. The walls of the base flickered and rippled like a mirage. Tommy's vision blurred, and the air grew thicker, suffocating. He glanced around, trying to make sense of the chaos, but everything was distorted, like pieces of a shattered mirror trying to fit together. His mind screamed in protest, trying to piece together memories, but they slipped away, fading as fast as they came. No, Tommy gasped. No, no, no. The walls of the hallway warped again, and then, with a sudden, jarring lurch, the scene around them shifted. The base was different now. The hallway they had just walked down was gone, replaced by one that was eerily familiar. The same cold metal walls, the same flashing red emergency lights. But the air was different, thicker, heavier. And the fog, ever present, had returned. Tommy's heart stopped. He glanced around at Brian, who looked just as confused, just as horrified. "We're back," Brian whispered, his voice strangled with disbelief. "We're back here." But they weren't alone. The hallway was filled with soldiers. Faces that Tommy recognized, but could not place. Their eyes were hollow, vacant. They stared at him, unblinking, as though they were waiting for something. Waiting for them to begin again. The realization hit Tommy like a physical blow. The fog had done its work. They were stuck. Stuck in an endless loop, a never-ending cycle of memory loss and regrowth, manipulated by the aliens who had constructed the entire scenario. They had never left. They had never escaped. And now, there was no way out. Brian turned to him, his eyes wild with panic. Are we dead?" Tommy didn't answer. He couldn't. The question itself didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was the fog. And the cycle. It would never end. The sun had just dipped beneath the horizon, casting an eerie orange hue over the city. The air felt thick, almost stifling, as if something was waiting to happen. That's when it came, first as a slight mist that rolled in from the direction of the coast, and then as a dense, oppressive fog that blanketed the streets, turning the city into a labyrinth of swirling gray. Maggie Carter stood at her apartment window, watching it creep forward like a living thing, its edges curling and twisting like fingers. The air smelled metallic, almost burnt, like a furnace left running too long. She tugged her jacket tighter, a chill running down her spine. "Maggie, you see this?" her brother, Jake, called from the kitchen, his voice tight with unease. She glanced at him, his lanky frame silhouetted against the harsh light of the kitchen. "Yeah, I see it. Feels wrong, doesn't it?" Jake, a tech specialist with a sharp mind and an even sharper sarcasm, stepped into the living room, squinting at the fog outside. He was about to speak when the news blared from the television in the background. A reporter's voice cut through the room, tense and filled with dread. "Authorities have issued a public warning for the unusual chemical fog spreading through multiple neighborhoods. Residents are urged to stay indoors. Medical professionals are reporting an increase in symptoms of dizziness, nausea, and respiratory distress. Further updates will be provided as we receive them. Stay tuned." Maggie's stomach twisted. What the hell is going on? Jake was already pulling his phone from his pocket, swiping through pages of articles. "This isn't just fog, Maggie. It's everywhere. It's deliberate. It's chemical. And it's been spotted with drones." "Wait." Maggie turned sharply, a knot forming in her chest. "Drones? You mean those things they've been talking about? The ones people think are government surveillance?" "Not just surveillance. People have been seeing them in the fog, hovering, watching. They're controlling it somehow." Maggie's heart began to race. Her brother's words didn't just sound paranoid, they sounded like a warning. She opened her mouth to speak, but the doorbell interrupted her. It rang with a sharpness that cut through the tension like a blade. "Who the hell is that?" she muttered under her breath. Jake exchanged a look with her, and he went to the door. When he opened it, no one was there. A thick, damp chill rushed in as though the fog itself was seeping through the walls. There was a small package on the doorstep. No note, no markings. Just a plain, unmarked box. "Jake," Maggie said, her voice trembling, "that's not normal." He bent down to pick it up, his brow furrowed. As his fingers brushed the cardboard, a drone buzzed overhead, just outside the window. They both froze, instinctively staring up. The drone was silent, sleek, almost invisible against the haze of the fog, but Maggie could feel its presence, a weight, a pressure in the air. It hovered for a moment, watching them, before slowly drifting away. Her pulse quickened. "I don't like this," Jake muttered, shaking the box as if expecting something to fall out. "Should we open it?" Maggie bit her lip. "No, we should call someone. Maybe the cops or..." Another drone buzzed past the window, this time far too close. It was much louder than the first, its mechanical hum filling the room. Jake immediately dropped the box and moved toward the window, pulling the curtains back. "Maggie, get down," he hissed urgently, grabbing her arm. Before Maggie could respond, the drone emitted a strange, high-pitched sound, a whirring that turned into a sharp crackle, like static cutting through a radio. The lights in the apartment flickered, and for a moment, everything went black. The power surged back on, but the room was now filled with a strange, eerie silence. Maggie's breath came out in short bursts, her chest tight. She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone anymore. That something, or someone, was watching. What the hell was that? Maggie gasped, trying to steady herself. Jake's hand was shaking as he reached for his phone. It's happening all over the city. I just checked the feeds. People are reporting that the drones are doing this to other neighborhoods, too. It's like they're shutting everything down." He turned to face Maggie, his face pale. "It's like they're trying to control us." The drone outside the window made another pass, closer this time. The faint hum now felt like it was in their bones. Maggie stood frozen, eyes wide with terror. "Something's coming," Jake said quietly. "And it's not just the fog." They didn't sleep that night. The fog thickened, and the drones didn't stop their circling. Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that the city was being prepared for something that had to do with the fog, and the drones, and the way it was making people act strange, as if their minds were fogged up, too. By morning, the city was eerily quiet. No sirens, no cars honking, just the heavy fog smothering everything. People stayed in their homes, watching the streets through their windows, as if waiting for something to happen. A low rumble of panic had set in across the city. Jake and Maggie stepped out into the street, walking with careful, deliberate steps. The fog seemed thicker now, pressing down on them, as if it were alive. The drone activity had increased, and every time they thought they saw one, there were two more behind it. They were everywhere. "I'm telling you, Maggie," Jake whispered, "this isn't some government experiment. It's alien. Look at the way they're moving, how precise they are. They know exactly what they're doing. I don't care what they are. This fog, it's changing everything," Maggie replied, her voice tense. "And it's not just fog. It's a weapon. It's a prelude." Jake stopped walking. "What are you talking about?" Maggie's face tightened with fear. "I think they're testing us. I think they've been watching us for a long time." Before Jake could respond, the ground beneath their feet trembled. The drones had arrived in greater numbers. Hundreds of them, circling high above, their glowing red lights flashing like an alien heartbeat. Then, through the dense mist, a voice crackled from the sky. "Compliance is the only way to survive." Maggie's blood ran cold. The voice was mechanical, devoid of emotion, but the words felt personal, like a warning specifically meant for her. "What the hell is that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake didn't respond immediately, his eyes darting from one side of the street to the other. The drones were now hovering just above their heads, casting long, looming shadows on the fog-covered pavement. He grabbed Maggie's arm, pulling her down an alley between two buildings. "What's happening?" Maggie demanded, panic rising in her chest. Jake looked at her, his expression grim. "I don't know, but we have to move. We can't stay out here." They ran through the fog, each breath growing harder as the air grew denser. The fog seemed to pull at them, like it wanted to drag them back, swallow them whole. They turned another corner, trying to find shelter, but the drones were everywhere now, blocking off any escape routes. "Jake, what are we supposed to do?" Maggie gasped, stopping to catch her breath. Jake was scanning the streets, his mind racing. There has to be something. Somewhere. A way to stop this. "Stop what?" Maggie shouted. "We're being hunted." Those things, there, another drone zipped by, so close that Maggie could feel the cold rush of air as it passed. The drones had begun to circle tighter, hurting them. She felt a sudden rush of claustrophobia, the fog, the drones, the silence, all of it closing in on them. Suddenly, from the other end of the alley, a figure emerged, stumbling through the fog. It was a man, his face gaunt, eyes wide with terror. They're everywhere," he whispered, voice cracking. "They're watching. They're controlling us. We have to stop them." Maggie grabbed his arm, desperate. "Who's controlling us? Who are they?" The man's eyes darted to the drones overhead. "They're not from here. They're not from this planet." His voice dropped to a whisper. "They've been watching us for years, using the fog as a way to weaken us. They want to invade. And we," he choked, tears welling in his eyes. "We're just part of the plan." Maggie's heart pounded. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't just a strange coincidence. They were right, and the city, the world, was about to be overtaken. The man's face twisted in horror. "They're not just testing us anymore. They've started. They're starting the invasion now." The words echoed in Maggie's mind, and then the ground shook beneath her once again. This time, it wasn't just the tremor of the fog settling, it was the beginning of something far worse. Suddenly, the voice crackled again, this time louder, more direct. "Prepare for assimilation. Resistance is futile." The fog had never seemed so menacing. It had been creeping through the streets of New York for hours now, enveloping the city in a cold, suffocating mist that blurred the world into a dreamlike haze. What started as a peculiar weather anomaly had turned into something far more terrifying, something that no one could have prepared for. But even as the city descended into madness, there were whispers that this fog wasn't just natural, it was deliberate. Megan Larson, a reporter for the New York Times, felt a gnawing unease deep in her gut as she stood on the sidewalk, watching the thick fog crawl along the streets. She glanced over at Marcus, her colleague, who was lighting a cigarette, his face illuminated only by the glow of the tip. Marcus had always been the skeptic, the one who downplayed everything, but even he couldn't ignore the heaviness in the air now. "You feel it too, don't you?" Megan asked, her voice trembling slightly. Marcus exhaled a cloud of smoke. "Feel what?" Megan stared into the mist. It's like the city's holding its breath. Like we're all waiting for something to happen." The fog had already done something strange to the atmosphere. The city's usual clamor, the honking cars, the chatter of pedestrians, was eerily absent. All that remained was an unnerving silence. The streetlights above flickered and buzzed, casting a dim, almost ghostly glow on the fog that swirled around them. It felt like the city had been frozen in time. "Okay, so we're a little freaked out." "I get it," Marcus said, pocketing the cigarette. "But it's just fog, Megan. Fog that comes from the river. Happens every year." Megan shook her head. "No, this feels different. I don't know how to explain it, but it's like the fog's alive. Like it's messing with us." Marcus interrupted, his tone dripping with skepticism. Before Megan could respond, the distant scream shattered the silence. A woman's scream. High-pitched and full of terror, it sliced through the stillness, sending chills down Megan's spine. It echoed from the direction of the convenience store on the corner. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her breath shallow. Marcus looked around, his eyes narrowing. "Probably just some dumb kid, Megan. It's New York. People scream all the time." But Megan's instincts told her something was wrong. Her heart thudded heavily in her chest. Without a word, she turned on her heel and started running toward the source of the scream. Marcus followed reluctantly, his footsteps heavy behind her. The fog seemed to close in as they ran. It felt almost as if it were chasing them, wrapping tighter around their limbs with every step. The towering buildings that usually felt so solid and imposing now appeared like dark shadows looming over them, their edges blurring in the mist. Megan's head spun. She could barely see where she was going, the fog so thick that it felt as though the world had shrunk to just a few feet ahead. They reached the convenience store, its windows cracked, the door hanging open. Inside, everything was overturned. Shelves had been emptied, cans and bottles scattered across the floor. The store was abandoned. Not a single soul in sight. "Emily?" Megan called, her voice trembling. Emily was their photographer, and the three of them had been working late into the night. She had been so excited about a new lead that she had rushed out earlier, promising to return in a few hours. But now, Megan feared the worst. A muffled cough came from the back of the store. Both Megan and Marcus spun around to see a figure emerging from the fog. It was a woman, her clothes disheveled, her hair matted with sweat, her face pale and wild-eyed. She staggered forward, as though she was lost. "Emily?" Megan called again, her heart pounding in her chest. The woman's eyes locked onto her, and for a moment, it seemed as though she didn't recognize Megan. She blinked rapidly, her mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. "Help me," she finally whispered, her voice cracked with fear. Megan rushed to her side, her hands trembling as she placed a gentle arm around her. "It's okay. We're here to help." "What happened? Where's Emily?" The woman shook her head, her face contorted with fear. She's gone. They took her." Her voice was barely audible as she leaned in closer. "You have to run. They'll get you too." "The fog, it's not just fog." Marcus stepped forward, his face hardening with disbelief. "What are you talking about? What happened to Emily?" "I don't know," the woman sobbed. "But they're not human. None of them are. They've been hiding in the fog, controlling people. They've taken Emily. She's one of them now." Megan recoiled, her mind racing. This couldn't be happening. It made no sense. But the woman's wild-eyed fear, her trembling hands, spoke volumes. "Stop," Marcus interrupted, his voice low and threatening. "You've had a bad night, lady. Get a hold of yourself." But as he spoke, something strange happened. The fog around them seemed to shift, moving in a way that was too deliberate, too coordinated to be natural. The air grew heavier, thicker. Megan gasped as the temperature dropped, her breath forming clouds in front of her face. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. A figure. Tall, cloaked in black, its face obscured by a hood. Its movements were eerily smooth, almost inhuman, and it was moving toward them, toward the woman. Megan's heart skipped a beat. "Marcus, look out!" Before she could react, the figure was upon them. It moved with blinding speed, grabbing the woman by the arm and lifting her off the ground. She screamed, but her voice was muffled, as though something was choking her. Megan rushed forward, but the figure was too powerful. It turned its head slightly, and Megan felt a cold shiver run through her as it locked eyes with her. It wasn't human. The figure's eyes were pitch black, their depths swirling with an unnatural glow. And in that moment, Megan realized the truth. This was no random attack. The fog was just a veil, one that hid something much darker beneath the surface. The woman's body went limp in the figure's grip. With a chilling whisper, it said, "You shouldn't have come here." Marcus froze, his breath caught in his throat. "What are you?" he stammered. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it reached into its cloak, pulling out a small syringe with a glowing, greenish liquid inside. Megan's blood ran cold as the figure stepped forward, its hand poised to inject the woman. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The fear was paralyzing. Without thinking, she grabbed the nearest object, a broken piece of shelf, and swung it at the figure. It connected with a sickening thud, but the figure didn't flinch. Instead, it dropped the woman's body to the floor and turned toward her. "You should have stayed hidden," the figure hissed. Before Megan could react, Marcus lunged forward, tackling the figure to the ground. But the figure didn't resist. Instead, it simply stood up, a strange, mechanical laugh echoing from beneath its hood. "You really don't understand, do you?" the figure spoke, its voice distorted. "This is only the beginning." With a sudden motion, the figure raised its hand. The fog around them seemed to respond, swirling violently, pulling the very air from Megan's lungs. She gasped for breath, her vision swimming as the world around her spun out of control. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, vanished into the dense fog, leaving only the woman's lifeless body behind. Megan stumbled back, her mind racing. What was happening? What had they just witnessed? "Get up." Marcus's voice cut through the fog. "We need to go, now." But Megan couldn't move. She was paralyzed by the horrifying realization, the government was behind this. The fog wasn't just a freak weather event, it was part of an experiment, a test. And they had just become part of it. In that moment, the city wasn't just shrouded in mist, it was suffocating under a dark, sinister force, one that no one had seen coming. And as the fog continued to roll across the streets, one thing became painfully clear: nothing would ever be the same again. And so, dear listener, another tale fades into the shadows. But remember, the darkness doesn't sleep. It only waits. If you enjoyed tonight's story, leave a like and share it with someone who dares to dream in the dark. Subscribe and make sure you hit the bell so you never miss when the next nightmare begins. Sleep well, if you can.